care everyone. Shall we wind it up here? So thank you all. Let's catch up at tomorrow we'll catch up at Monday with different topic. Thank you all. Have a nice day.
Good evening. Am I audible to everyone? Rohit, good evening. Vani, good evening. Am I audible to everyone? Lakshmi, good evening. Lavanya, good evening. Yes, what we discussed yesterday? Yes, good evening everybody. Arun, good evening. Aditya, good evening. Am I audible to everyone? What we discussed yesterday? Yes, data models. So what are all the different types? What do you mean by a data model? Anybody can explain? What do you mean by a data model? Yes, I was discussing with you about RDBMS, Relational Database Management System. What do you mean by a data model? Yes, data schema. So what do you mean by a data model? I was discussing with you about data models, right? Yes, it defines the logical structure of a database. And what do you mean by a schema? What do you mean by a schema? So what are all the different things I discussed in my previous class? Please respond. What do you mean by a schema? And what are the different types of schema? Yesterday's class, what I discussed? Yes. So there are different types of schemas. What do you mean by a logical schema and physical schema? Yes, it defines the logical structure of the database. What do you mean by a logical schema and what do you mean by a physical schema? Yes, it provides the logical view of the entire database. What do you mean by a logical schema and what do you mean by a physical schema? Yes, logical schema, view of the entire database. Yes. Yes, whatever I discussed in my previous class, so everything is clear. What do you mean by a data model? What do you mean by a data model? Yes, good evening to everybody. What do you mean by a data model? Yes, actual storage of data, it is called as a physical schema. And what do you mean by a logical schema? And what do you mean by a logical schema? Please respond. Yes. So till this part, whatever I am discussing, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? So yesterday I just started with data independence. So logical structure of the database. So what do you mean by data independence? Yes, logical constraints, logical structure of the database. So what do you mean by data independence? Yesterday I just started with data independence. What do you mean by data independence? Please respond. Yes, what do you mean by data independence? Yes, independence. So database systems are designed in multi-layers. So what are the different features? Multi-user access, multiple views. So all these are the different features of DBMS, Database Management System. So what do you mean by data independence? So whenever I am going to consider any database system, it normally contains a lot of data in addition to the user's data. For example, I am going to store the data about data. It's known as metadata in order to locate and retrieve the data easily. Clear with this? Yes, I can go for different types of storage. I can go for primary storage, secondary storage. So what do you mean by metadata? Anybody can tell me what do you mean by metadata? Yes, anybody can tell me what do you mean by metadata? So metadata, it stores data about data. So it is known as metadata in order to locate and retrieve the data easily. You are not able to hear my voice, Sunil Kumar. Am I audible to everyone? Yes. So what do you mean by this metadata? So it stores some information about the data in order to locate and retrieve the data easily. So once I am going to store some metadata, so it contains information about the data. Yeah, data about data. So it is stored in the database. So as the DBMS expands, it needs to change over time in order to satisfy the requirements of the users. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this? So whenever, as I was telling you, right, so what do you mean by database management system? So whenever I am going to, you can consider any online website. So a huge volume of transaction is happening. So each and every day dynamically, as and when the data grows, the DBMS expands. So it needs to change over time in order to satisfy the requirements of the users. So as and when new users, for example, you can consider an e-commerce industry, Amazon, Flipkart, or you can consider any other type of industry. So you can consider a banking management system, hospital management system. So each and every day, as and when the data is growing, so the DBMS expands, it needs to change over time in order to satisfy the requirements of the users. So what do you mean by this data independence? So if the data is dependent, so it is going to be a very tedious and highly complex job. Yes, so in order to overcome this, we are going for this data independence concept. So I have two different types of independence. So data in one schema, it is going to be separately, it is going to act separately. It is not going to, whenever I am going to change some data, it is not going to affect any other data in my database. So I have two different types of schema. So one is called as a logical schema and one more is called as a physical schema. So it is called as a logical data independence and one more is called as a physical data independence. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this data independence? So what do you mean by this metadata? It contains data about data. So it follows a layered architecture. So whenever I am going to change the data at one layer, it is not going to affect the data at another level. So this is what is called as data independence, multi-layered architecture, a layered architecture. So whenever I am going to change the data at one layer, it is not going to affect the data at another level. So the data is independent but mapped to each other. So logical data independence. So in case of data independence, so if the data is dependent, it is going to be a very tedious task. So for example, one part of data is affected, it is going to affect some other part of data. So I have two different types of data independence. One is called as a logical data independence and one more is called as a physical data independence. So what do you mean by this logical data independence? So it is nothing but the data about the database. So whenever I am going to store some data, so I need some independence. I have two different types of independence. One is called as a logical data independence. So whenever I am going to store some data about the database, it stores the information about how the data is managed inside. For example, a table stored in the database and all its constraints applied on that relation. So whenever I am going to consider some table, so a table stored in the database and all its constraints applied on that relation. So what are the different columns that are present in the table and what are the different types of constraints? I can go for primary key constraint, foreign key constraint, not null constraint. So it is a kind of mechanism, it liberalizes itself from the actual data stored on the disk. So if I am going to do some changes in the table format, it should not change the data residing on the disk. So from the name you can just understand what do you mean by this logical data independence. Whereas, so whenever I am going to change some information, so this is the important term you should understand. It follows a layered architecture so that whenever I am going to change the data at one layer, it is not going to affect the data at another level. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this logical data independence? So it is a kind of mechanism. It liberalizes itself from actual data stored on the disk. So whenever I am going to do some changes on the table format, so it should not change the data residing on the disk. So this is what is called as logical data independence. So there is one more type of data independence. It is called as a physical data independence. So what do you mean by this physical data independence? So what do you mean by this physical data independence? So all the schemas are logical and the actual data is stored in bit format on the disk. Clear with this? So this is what is called as physical data independence. So it is the power to change the physical data without impacting the schema or logical schema. For example, in case if I want to change or upgrade the storage system itself. Suppose for example I want to replace hard disk with SSD. So it should not have any impact on the logical data or schemas. So this is what is called as physical data independence. So all the schemas are logical and the actual data is stored in bit format on the disk. So what do you mean by this physical data independence? So it is the power to change the physical data without impacting the schema or the logical data. So whenever I am going to make some change on the data stored in the disk, so it is not going to affect my logical data. So this is what is called as physical data independence. So as and when as the volume of data is increasing, so as I was telling you, right, so each and every day a huge amount of transactions are happening. So whenever I am going to consider some banking sector or you can consider a hospital management system, restaurant management system. So wherever you go, so as the volume of data is going to increase, for example, I need to upgrade my storage system. For example, I want to replace the hard disk with SSD. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this data independence? So I have two different types of data independence. One is called as a logical data independence and one more is called as a physical data independence. So which one you want me to explain again? Which one you want me to explain again? So far I just gave you some brief introduction to data independence. So what do you mean by this data independence and what are the different types? Why I have to go for this? So if the data in one layer, it is going to be dependent on other data. So whenever I'm going to make some changes, it is going to be a very complex task. So in order to overcome all these complexities, I'm going for this data independence concept. So next I'm going to discuss with you about the ER model, that is entity relationship model. So what do you mean by this ER model? So entity relationship model. So I'm going to provide a conceptual view of the database. So it is going to work around the real world entities and the associations among them. So entity relationship model. So it defines the conceptual view of a database. So whenever I am going to consider any real world entities, each and every unit, it is a standalone entity or a class. For example, there will be a student class or a student entity. And there will be a patient class or a patient entity. So what do you mean by this ER model, entity relationship model? So it works around the real world entities and the associations among them. So how the various entities, how they are being related to each other. So the ER model, it is considered as a good option for designing databases. So what do you mean by this ER model? Clear with this? So how the various tables, I'm going to define initially when I gave you some introduction to DBMS, I was discussing with you about different types of mapping cardinalities. So how the table, data in one table, how it is being associated to the data in another table. Which one you want me to repeat, Ankita? Yes, one-to-one relationship, one-to-many, many-to-one and many-to-many relationship. So the ER model is considered as a good option for designing databases. Yes, physical data independence and then logical data independence. So what do you mean by this ER model? So it is considered as a good option for designing databases. So I have different concepts. I can go for entity. So what do you mean by an entity? So it can be any real world objects, either animate. So for example, it can be easily identifiable. Physical data independence, you want me to explain again? So what do you mean by this physical data independence? So as I was telling you, right, physical, whenever I am going to change, for example, as the amount of data is going to increase, for example, I want to upgrade my storage system. So I am going to replace the hard disk with SSD. So it should not have any impact on the logical data. So this is what is called as physical data independence. So from the term you can just understand what do you mean by this physical data independence. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this physical data independence? So I want to upgrade the storage system. Suppose I want to replace hard disk with SSD. Yeah, clear with this, please. Once your doubts are clear, please let me know. So whatever I'm explaining, once your doubts are clear, please let me know. Yes. So you're clear with Ankita, you're clear with physical data independence. What do you mean by physical data independence? Yes. All right. So next I'm going to discuss with you about ER model. entity relationship model. So what do you mean by, I'm going to discuss what are all the different entities. So whenever I'm going to design a database for any kind of project, for any application, so I should consider this ER model. So what is the relationship between the real world entities? So what do you mean by this entity? An entity can be any real world object. Say for example, it can be an animate. For example, in a school database, students, teachers, classes, courses, it can be any standalone unit. So for example, there can be a student table. There can be a teacher's table, courses offered. So all these are considered as entities. So they have some attributes or properties that give them their identity. Clear with this? So what do you mean by an entity? You can imagine. So any real world object. For example, I'm going to develop a database for a hospital management system. So you can take up any entity. For example, there will be patients or doctors. So I'm going to create separate and I'm going to establish a relationship between the doctor table and the patient table. I'm going to discuss with you about different types of keys as well. What do you mean by a primary key, foreign key, constraints? How two tables are being related to each other? What is the relationship or association between two tables? So in this scenario, I am just taking a school database. In an academic institution, I am taking up a school database. So students, teachers, classes, courses offered, all these can be considered as entities. So an entity set can be a collection of similar types of entities. So it can contain entities with attributes sharing similar values. So a student set may contain all the students of a school. Likewise, a teacher set may contain all the teachers of a school from all faculties. So clear with this? So what do you mean by an entity set? So it is a collection of similar types of entities. A student set, it may contain all the students of a school. Likewise, a teacher set may contain all the teachers of a school from all the faculties. So entity set. So what do you mean by an entity set? It is a collection of similar types of entities. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this entity set? And what do you mean by this attributes? So far I was discussing with you about entities. What do you mean by an entity set? And then I am going to discuss with you about attributes. So the entities, they are represented by means of their properties called attributes. So far, for example, I am having a person. So a person can have a name. What is the age of a person? Gender of a person. So the entities are represented by means of their properties called attributes. Clear with this? So all attributes, they have some values. A student entity, he may have some name, class, age. So there exists a domain or a range of values. It can be assigned to attributes. Clear with this? So I'm just giving you a brief introduction to this ER model. So this is one important concept you should understand. When you're developing a database for a bigger application, so you should know. So what are the different entities and how they are being related to each other. Similarly, whenever you can consider in a e-commerce website, for example, I have a customer table, order table. So inside my order table, so whatever is the order ID, order name. Clear with this? So attributes, they have some values. So what do you mean by this attributes? For example, a student's name cannot be a numeric value. It has to be alphabetic. Clear with this? So what are the different attributes? It describes an entity. So you can go for different types of attributes. So far I just gave you some brief introduction to entities. So what do you mean by entities? So next I'm going to discuss with you about the different types of attributes. So I can go for a simple attribute, composite attribute, derived attributes. So all these are the different types of attributes. Yes, I'm giving you some examples, right? So I gave you a student example. So it is a real-time example, right? A student database, so you can consider a school. Likewise, a teacher may contain a teachers of a school from all faculty. So it is a entity set. Clear with this? So please acknowledge. Once your doubts are clear, please acknowledge. So let me just proceed with the next part. So I just gave you some examples of attributes. So till this part, whatever I am speaking, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? Yes, I am giving, right? So similarly, you can consider in a e-commerce industry, you can consider a customer table or a customer. You can say a customer, or you can say what are all the purchase, order. So all these are considered as separate entities. Clear with this? So what do you mean by an entity? So till this part, whatever I am speaking, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. You want me to explain entity set? So what we are going to see in this 30 days masterclass. So firstly, I just started with what do you mean by DBMS? Database Management System. So I'm going to discuss with you about different DBMS concepts, chords, rules. And then I will be giving you a brief introduction to SQL. What do you mean by structured query language? And then I will be giving you a brief introduction to MongoDB. Clear with this? So you want me to explain the entity set. So let me just explain. The entity set. One minute, let me just explain. So what do you mean by an entity? An entity is any real world object, whereas an entity set, it is nothing but a collection of similar types of entities. For example, a student's, it may not contain the student of a school. It may contain all the students of a school. A student set, it may contain all the students of a school. Likewise, a teacher set, it may contain all the teachers of a school from all faculties. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this entity set? So far I just gave you a brief introduction to entity. So I'm just discussing with you about entity sets. So what do you mean by attributes? I just discussed with you about entity sets and attributes. Clear with this? So next I'm going to discuss with you about different types of attributes. So what do you mean by attributes? So it just represents, for example, a student's name, it cannot be a numeric value. So it has to be alphanumeric. Yes. So next I'm going to discuss with you about different types of attributes. So whenever we have some attributes, I'm going to discuss with you about different types of attributes. So I can go for a simple attribute, I can go for a composite attribute or a derived attribute. So what do you mean by this simple attribute? So attributes are nothing but the atomic values. So it cannot be divided further. For example, a student's phone number, it is an atomic value of 10 digits. So it cannot be divided further. Clear with this? So this is what is called as a simple attribute. So what do you mean by a composite attribute? So whenever they are made of more than one simple attribute. For example, a student's complete name, it may have a mixture of first name and last name. So this is what is called as a composite attribute. You can consider a student's phone number is a simple attribute, or a student's age, it is a simple attribute. Whereas, what do you mean by this composite attribute? So a student's complete name, it may have a mix of first name and last name. And there is one more type of attribute, it is called as a derived attribute. So what do you mean by this derived attribute? So derived attributes, they are the attributes that do not exist in the physical database. So clear with this? So what do you mean by this derived attribute? Their values are derived from other attributes present in the database. For example, average salary in a department, it should not be saved directly in the database. Instead, it can be derived. So from the name, you can just understand. So what are the different types of attribute? What do you mean by a simple attribute? What do you mean by a composite attribute? And what do you mean by a derived attribute? Clear with this? For example, a age can be derived from the date of birth. So this is what is called as a derived attribute. So all these, so I'm just giving you a brief introduction. So how I'm going to represent an entity. So an entity is nothing but a standalone unit. So each and every entity is represented by a table in the database. So single valued attributes, multi-valued attributes. So what do you mean by this single valued attributes? They contain single value. For example, SSN number, social security number, single valued attributes. Multi-valued attributes, they contain more than one number, more than one value. So all these are the different types of attributes. So for example, whenever you are considering, I am having an employee registration form, or I am having a student registration form, customer registration form. So a person can have more than one phone number, he can have more than one email address. So all these are called as multi-valued attribute. Clear with this? So what are the different types of attributes? So all these are the different types. So based on my requirement, you can just imagine. So I am considering a student database. Similarly, you can consider whatever type of database. I am going to develop a database for a corporate company, an employee database. Or you can consider a patient, a doctor's database. I want to store the patient's details. So what are the different types of attributes? So attributes, how I'm going to define an entity. So I can go for simple attribute, composite attribute. So all these are the different types of attributes. I can go for derived attributes as well. So what do you mean by this derived attributes? From the name you can just understand. The average salary in a department, it can't be saved directly in the database. Instead, it can be derived. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this derived attribute, single valued attribute, multi-valued attributes? So what do you mean by this multi-valued attributes? They contain more than one value. For example, a person can have more than one phone number, email address. So this is what is called as a multi-valued attribute. Clear with this? So you can combine the attribute types can come together. So based on your requirement, simple single valued attribute, simple multi-valued, composite single valued or composite multi-valued attributes. You can go for any of these combinations. So all these are the different types of attributes. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this attributes and what are all the different types of attributes? So simple single valued, simple multi-valued, composite single valued and composite multi-valued attributes. So till this part, whatever I am discussing, everything is clear. Yes, you can consider, you can have student ID, you can go for employee name. So all these are simple attributes. So far I just gave you some introduction to attributes. What do you mean by attributes? So next I am going to discuss with you about entity set and keys. So what do you mean by an entity set and what do you mean by a key? So key is an attribute or a collection of attributes. They uniquely identify an entity among the entity set. Clear with this? So what do you mean by a key? So whenever I am going to, all these are the important terms you should understand. So whenever I am going to draw an ER diagram, entity relationship diagram, so all these are the important terms you should understand. So what do you mean by a key? So key is an attribute or a collection of attributes. They uniquely identify an entire entity among the entity set. So the roll number of a student, it makes him or her identifiable among the students. Clear with this? So whenever a student is having some roll number, similarly in an organization, employee. So how I am going to identify each and every employee? By his employee ID. So the roll number of a student makes him or her identifiable among the students. So he can have a super key and a candidate key. So what do you mean by this super key? A set of attributes that collectively identifies an entity in an entity set. So it is called as a super key and candidate key. For example, employee ID and employee name. So these two, it forms a tuple. You can consider this tuple as a super key. An employee ID should be unique, whereas two employees, they can have the same name. And what do you mean by a candidate key? So other than this, I have the SSN and some other details about the employee. So it is called as a candidate key. Clear with this? So whenever you're, as I was telling you, right? So everything, whenever I want to store something in the database, everything is stored in the form of tables, tabular data structure. So what do you mean by entity set and what are all the different types of keys? So firstly, I just discussed with you about super key. And then I discussed with you about candidate key. So next I am going to discuss with you about primary key. So what do you mean by this primary key? So it is one of the candidate keys chosen by the database designer to uniquely identify the entity set. For example, each and every employee, he can have a unique ID. And each and every student, he can have a unique student ID. So it is called as a primary key. Clear with this? So what are the different types of keys? So I can go for a super key, candidate key and then primary key. So the next important term, whenever I am going to draw any UR diagram, so you should understand. So what do you mean by a relationship? So what do you mean by a relationship? The association among the entities, it is called as a relationship. For example, an employee works at a department. A student is going to enroll in a course. So works at and enrolls. All these are called relationships. So what is the relation between an employee table and a department table? So as I was telling you, right, whenever I'm going to consider what is the use of this RDBMS, Relational Database Management System. Yesterday when I was discussing with you about few concepts, I was discussing with you about RDBMS, Relational Database Management System. So what do you mean by this? Employee works at a department, a student enrolls in a course. So employee, what is the relationship between this employee table and the department table? So works at. So it is called as a relationship, and a student is enrolled in a course. So what is the relationship between the student table and this course table? He is enrolling. So whenever I want to establish a relation between the employee table, I can use the department ID as the foreign key. Primary key, foreign key relationship. Clear with this? So this concept, it is called as, whenever I'm going to establish some relationship between the different tables present in my database, it is called as a RDBMS, Relational Database Management System. So what do you mean by this relationship set? Set of relationships of similar type, it is called as a relationship set. So like entities, a relationship two can have attributes. These attributes are called descriptive attributes. Clear with this? So what do you mean by a relationship and what do you mean by a relationship set? So number of participating entities in a relationship defines the degree of the relationship. For example, I have binary relationship, ternary and n-array. So what is the degree of relationship? Clear with this? So what do you mean by a relationship and what do you mean by a relationship set? So all these are the different degree of relationship. For example, I can go for a binary degree. So whenever it defines the number of participating entities in a relationship, it defines the degree of the relationship. So binary relationship, ternary and n-array relationship. Clear with this? So what are the important concepts? So all these are the important concepts whenever I am going to draw the entity relationship diagram. So next important term is the cardinality. So what do you mean by this? Cardinality. It defines the number of entities in one entity set. It can be associated with the number of entities of other set. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this cardinality? So one-to-one cardinality, one-to-many, many-to-one. So all these are the different types of associations or mapping cardinality. So it is one important term. So whenever you are going to draw any kind of ER diagram, so you should understand what do you mean by a cardinality. So cardinality defines the number of entities in one entity set, how it can be associated with the number of entities of the other set via the relationship set. So what do you mean by this one-to-one relationship? So one entity from entity set A, it can be associated with at most one entity of entity set B. Clear with this? So this is what is called as one-to-one cardinality. So this is my entity set A and set B. So one from this entity, it can be associated to one from the other entity set. And I can go for one-to-many cardinality. So one-to-many association. For example, I have this one entity from entity set A. It can be associated with more than one entity of entity set B. Clear with this? So this is what is called as one-to-many relationship. So I can go for one-to-one relationship, or I can go for one-to-many relationship. And there is one more type of cardinality. It is called as many to one. So from the name you can just understand. So what do you mean by this association or cardinality rule mining? So when more than one entity from entity set A, it can be associated with at most one entity of entity set B. So this is called as many to one relationship. Clear with this? So all these are the important ER model concepts. So with this, I'm just stopping today. If you have any doubts, you can just ask me. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS internship program. DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving the internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. A primary key, a key which uniquely identifies. For example, in an employee table, employee ID is the primary key. Whereas candidate key, all other details. For example, you can have some SSN number and other attributes, they are called as candidate key. Any more doubts? If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS internship program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Foreign key is different. Foreign key is one of the candidate keys. Other than that, any more doubts? I hope I'm clear with my topics. So an entity is nothing but a standalone unit or a class. So it is called as an entity. For example, you can have a student and what are all the other details. All these are called as entities. A teacher, a student. So entity set, it is a collection of similar type of entities. A collection of students, a collection of teachers. Any more doubts? I hope I'm clear with my topics. Remaining things we will see tomorrow. Same time, same link. Thank you all.